Okay, so we're going to go over promise in JavaScript. So promises are used when we want to make asynchronous calls. They were released with the Xmas 2016, and they're an improvement to get rid of kind of callback hell and nesting of calls. So right now I'm just going to create a basic promise. So I'm going to call it my promise. It was new promise. So here you can see from the IntelliSense that the first argument to be passed in will be executed straight away. It's called executor. So here I'm just going to pass in basic function. The two parameters that are available in this function are the resolve and reject. So those two are called when we want to return. So whatever we've done is completed, and then we want to return back that value. So we call the resolve when it's been successful and the reject when it's been unsuccessful. So the code here will be executed straight away. So what I'm actually going to do is just use a set timeout, just so that I can mimic a call to an API. So right here I'm just going to do a basic response. So we're going to return a resolve. So we're going to say it's successful. We're going to say success. And we're going to wait 1 second. Okay. So now what you'll see now is when I do a console.log is that we'll actually be able to see just the state of pending. And when I try and do a console log of my promise here. So do node. So this means that we can't actually see the result. We haven't actually received the resolve callback here. So what we actually want to do is, instead of doing a console log like this, we need to add on a handler called then. So the then handler has two arguments. So the first one is for success and the second one is for the error. So here I'll expect a response parameter. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the console log here as promise. So then hit, and we're going to pass in the response here. So what you'll be able to see now is that we'll execute this code. The timeout will start. The timer will start after 1 second. It will then call the resolve function, which then passes down to here, which signals for any of the then listeners or subscribers on the promise. And this response value will have the value of whatever is in here. So right now we have just a success, or a string with the value of success. The console log statement then will fire with the then hit, and we'll have a response here of success. So you can see it there now. So that was successful. Okay, so as I mentioned, the then handler will or can accept two arguments. So here is in the second one, we're actually expecting an error. So this will be triggered when the reject has been called in a promise. So what I'm going to do is console.error. So error occurred, called. We're going to pass in the error response there. So the change that we're going to make up here in the set timeout is to, instead of call resolve with success, we're going to call reject, and we're going to pass in a new array, or sorry, new error. So an error has occurred. So we can pass in a string here or anything else that we like, but it is best practice to pass in an error object. So now when I do node promises.js, we see here. So we see our error called, and then we see an error has occurred. An error has occurred. Okay. So I can even do error.message if I want. And I'll just, yeah, so you see here. Now, okay, so the other way to handle an error is to have an explicit dot catch. So a dot catch is the exact same as our second argument here. So we can essentially just copy and paste this here. So we go, let's call this our catch error, just to make things that little bit easier for us and clearer for us. Catch error called. So what this is essentially like we've passed in null and a second parameter here. So this catch is actually the same as a dot then with a null for the first argument, and the function passed in as a second argument for the reject. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to remove this, the second argument, so that we can be sure that our catch is going to catch the error. Great, so now you can see down below, catch error called. So that's our catch error called. An error has occurred. Okay, so the other handler that we can attach here is finally. So finally will be fired on every response from promise. So it'll be either on either the resolve or reject. So it doesn't differentiate, and it doesn't know whether the resolve was triggered or it was reject that was triggered. So I'll put in here is console.log finally. So now when I call this, we should see after 1 second wait, catch error called, an error has occurred, and then in the next line we'll see finally. Okay, you can see that here. So again, just to reconfirm that finally is called for both reject and for resolve. I'm going to swap this back to be a resolve. I'm going to put in success. So now we'll see then hit success finally in our output here. Okay, so you see there, then hit success finally. Okay, so the other thing that is useful with promises is that we can chain dot then handlers to happen one after the other, passing a promise down through the then handlers. So say if we actually didn't return success here and we passed just a figure, so we passed number 1 here. So what will happen now is this response is to say then hit the number 1. So if I want to return make a change to that response value and then return it again, I would simply do response plus 1 and return that, and then I will create another .then clause which will expect that response 2 and I'm actually just going to copy this in here just for ease. So then when this handler receives the value, it will be the response from the original one plus this one, number 1 here. So we're expecting then hit response 2 to be the number 2, and we'll do a third then clause without the extra response at the end. We'll call this just response 3 for the sake of clarity. So now what we're going to expect is that when we run this function, we'll get a then hit number 1 because resolve was called with the number 1. Then what will happen is the response value, which is number 1, will be added with the number 1. That value will be returned to the then handler here, which will have the response 2, which will be the value 2. So we'll see it will print it out, then hit number 2. And again, we add 1 to that again and return it. So in the final .then handler here, we will then hit 3, and then we will also hit the finally console log. So we'll run that. So you see here we have then hit 1, then hit 2, then hit 3, and finally. Okay, so that was the chaining of promises. So what we're also able to do is to add our then handlers or our catch handlers or our finally handlers, not directly onto the function call or the initialization of our promise. We can actually do it at a later date, but by doing it afterwards, it means that we won't have the chaining of these thens. So if we kept those 3 then handlers, what would happen is that we would see these 3 console logs here all have the same number because they will not be tied together in sequence. So say if I change this now to be my promise, so I'm changing all of these to be explicitly set on the promise that I've created after it's been created. So now when we see the log statements, we'll see then hit 1, we'll see then hit 1, we'll see then hit 1, and then we'll see finally. Okay, so this was promises.